Hello, this is the lecture video for Module 1, Psychology of Disaster Response and Preparedness for Sci 333E, Psychology of Disaster and Climate Change at the University of Maine at Augusta. So the deadline for this module is midnight Sunday, September 11th, and this module should take you about 2 weeks worth of classwork and homework to complete. In this module, we have 5 readings, plus a link to the APA Disaster Information webpage. The topics cover a number of different psychological constructs dealing with disaster. We start with the kind of emotional, psychological experience of having had an impact, a psychological impact from having experienced a disaster and the ways in which people respond to that. Then we move on to other facets of psychology, so cognition and thinking, decision making, and here we're thinking about us as individuals preparing for disasters and recovering from disasters, but we're also thinking about disaster professionals, considering how to do their jobs effectively, but also considering how to do their jobs effectively given the human population they're serving and the psychology that they're going to be experiencing. Now our first reading is a pretty short one. It's from Bonanno, Resilience in the Face of Potential Trauma. This is a lessons learned summary of previous findings or findings from previous research regarding resilience and when trauma is occurring, and the different coping strategies that people often employ. In our society, we have a better understanding of the psychological responses to trauma these days, much more so now than, say, 70, 80 years ago. After World War II, our country was kind of flooded with soldiers coming home, many of whom were dealing with post-traumatic stress and other difficult psychological responses to having spent years in war. As a nation, we were not equipped, and in fact, the aftermath of World War II is what spurred a lot of the development of community mental health resources and counseling and research. And as a nation, we are continually getting better at understanding and responding to, discussing, and now I'd even say destigmatizing a lot of post-traumatic stress and other mental health issues associated not just with war, but with all types of traumatic experiences. As a quick side note, I do want to mention that post-traumatic stress, like most psychological experiences, occurs along a spectrum. So a clinical diagnosis of PTSD with a disorder from a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist, it means that the post-traumatic stress is on the worst end of that spectrum, to the point that it is causing significant disorder or impairment within the person's regular life and functioning. More than half of people will experience a traumatic event of some type in their lifetimes, but they won't all develop PTSD. Nearly everyone will have some sort of psychological response to the event, but what Bonanno is talking about in this chapter, or in this article, is that humans will cope. They will respond with resilience to trauma. And so psychology as a field wants to look not just at the negative responses to trauma, but also to some of these more positive, strengths-based responses to trauma. Specifically, consider how we can support resilience in coping so that it's more likely to be present and less likely for people to experience these negative psychological responses to negative traumatic events. Our next reading is Bunny, the Psychological Aftermath of Disasters. And this is actually a case study of the psychological research conducted after 9/11. This obviously was not a natural disaster, but I included it because there's an enormous amount of research and psychological interventions that were conducted and put into play following 9/11. And so it's a really good resource to disaster professionals. This reading reading also discusses many of the differences that are commonly seen in responses according to different demographics and vulnerability, proximity to the event, other situational factors following a disaster. So in some regards, there are overlaps with the other reading, but it also gets into some of the neurological and biological interactions with our psychological responses. Now, the brain is part of the body, obviously, but a lot of times in the United States, we think of it as a separate system, like disconnected entirely. And so it's very important that we think about our brain as part of our body. A lot of times we think about our brains in terms of thinking and learning and memory. But of course, there's also processing sensory information. All of the information that comes in through our sense organs, our eyes and our ears and our skin. Our brains take all of this information and then make sense of it in a useful way to us so that we can use this information. And additionally, our brains are controlling all of our movements through our somatic division of our peripheral nervous system, and also like all of our organs and involuntary responses through the autonomic nervous system, or the autonomic division within our peripheral nervous system. And this includes things like our heart rate and our lung capacity, our hormone cycles, our fight or flight response. All of these physical systems within our body, our organs and our endocrine system and our brain work in conjunction with each other for our psychology, our emotions, our interactions with the world. If our adrenal gland goes haywire and starts pumping high levels of adrenaline into our physical system, a lot is going to change, right? Similarly, if our brain's working shift in response to a traumatic event, that means all of the things controlled by our brains could change in response. Our heart rate, the production of hormones and neurotransmitters, the appropriate triggering of fight or flight response. This is not just a matter of feeling emotionally bad or off after a bad experience. This really could be the entire system of our bodies are working differently because the central processing unit of the system is working differently, and it's no longer giving out the regular instructions that it did before. Even without severe or diagnosable psychopathology following a disaster event, a lot of people will commonly report not feeling like themselves because they're not like themselves. There's been a shift in that functioning. And so read this article. There's some insight into different biological and neurological impacts that are commonly seen and some of the issues that are correlated with them following a disaster event. And then finally, I have you looking at the American Psychological Association's page on disasters. The APA is the premier professional organization for psychologists in the United States and to some extent to the rest of the world. And this site on disasters is a good user-friendly page with resources and information for researchers and professionals, but also to lay people who have interest or experience with disasters. And it's a good resource to know about and to know when and where and how to access it and use it. So check through it, see what's there, have fun, a lot of interesting things. Next, we have an article from Perry and Lindell, who we're familiar with from our previous readings. This is Preparedness for Emergency Response, Guidelines for Emergency Planning Process. The nutshell version of this article is something that will be obvious to you now after these past few weeks in this class. There's a difference between having a written plan and planning for an emergency. So here in this article, Perry and Lindell provide research and evidence-based guidance for planning for disasters. This article is a tremendous resource, and I do suggest, especially for those of you that are going into explicitly disaster-related fields, set this article aside for future reference. I learn a lot from it every time I read it. Non-disaster professionals often operate with the sense that somebody in government or somewhere else has a plan that can be followed without a hitch when disasters occur, and that the only reason things go wrong is that either A, folks don't have a plan the way that they should, or B, they have a plan but they don't follow it. In this article, you'll start to understand that there are so many facets to disaster preparedness, so many working parts, bringing lots of aspects of society together, and there can be difficulties at any one of these points. Additionally, disaster professionals have to work with people, human people who have different levels of preparedness and priorities and plans, and make different decisions for different reasons. And disaster professionals have to get all of these folks to be safe. Now, some of this psychology is predictable. For example, with an evacuation, a disaster is coming, say a hurricane or a volcano, etc., and we need people not to be in the way of this disaster because they're less likely to die if they're not there. So we have an evacuation order, and there are multiple possible outcomes to having placed this order. So first is we have the evacuation order. Everyone evacuates, the disaster strikes, no lives are lost. Whatever damage happens, it doesn't happen to people because people are not there. Our second option is there's an evacuation order. Not everyone evacuates, either because they are stubborn or ornery and decide not to evacuate, or because they simply lack the resources in order to evacuate and aren't able to follow the order, even though they might have otherwise. The disaster strikes, and then some lives are lost because some people are there. Now, a third possibility is that there's the evacuation order. Everyone evacuates or doesn't evacuate. It kind of doesn't matter for this scenario because the disaster doesn't strike or isn't as bad as it was supposed to be, because nature is unpredictable. Even with our really great models for weathers and other natural hazards that we have now, they're not 100% perfect because there are so many different parts. People are inconvenienced. They lose time at work. They have to go away and come back. It costs money, etc., etc. Or they stay behind, they don't evacuate, and then nothing happens, and they think, yes, I was proven right. I should not have evacuated. But they learn not to trust evacuation orders. And then, the next time an evacuation order comes, what are they going to do? And so this is just one part of the psychology of people, humans, and societies that we have to consider when we're thinking about disaster preparedness. And now let's consider still the evacuation order, but actually at the moment in which the evacuation order is given. There is a pause between receiving an order and actually evacuating. And during this pause, people are assessing the information they've received, they're making decisions about it, they check in with others, their neighbors, their family, their boss, whoever else. They make plans. How am I going to evacuate? When am I going to evacuate? What should I take with me? How do I make sure everything's prepared? And they waver. They go back and forth on whether or not they're going to be stubborn and stay, or if they're going to follow the order and go. Now, if I, a disaster management professional, give the order the moment they need to evacuate, there is not enough time for them to actually evacuate and be safe because of this pause. People are going to stick around for a little bit, and I know this, and so I need to plan that little bit in. How long is that little bit? That's a hard question, because if I give the order too early and folks leave and then they're gone and nothing's happening because the disaster hasn't hit yet, some people are going to come back and then they're right in the way of that disaster when it does hit. And so you can start to see there's an awful lot of things that go into any level of preparedness, any point of preparedness that both disaster management professionals have to consider, but also they're considering what's going on within the psychology of the many different diverse people that they're serving. Now, next we have two handbooks that I created last year with the assistance, actually, of some UMA students. This is Disaster Preparedness in Maui and Disaster Preparedness in American Samoa. A bit of background on this research. I was awarded the American Psychological Foundation Visionary Grant, which funded this research. I'm a climate change researcher, but a lot of times we think about and deal with climate change in the short term with these discrete disaster events. And we know in the psychology of climate change that knowledge about climate change does not necessarily mean that people feel the risk from climate change and then act on it. We'll talk about this again later in the semester. And also, as you've learned already, after experiencing a disaster, even people who don't have PTSD still often experience higher rates of anxiety. I had also heard during previous research in Tuvalu and around the Pacific, people saying things like, well, if I didn't believe in climate change before this disaster experience, after experiencing that, I certainly do now. And I heard this enough times, and I've had colleagues hear this as well, that as a researcher, I thought, I have to measure this. And so what I'm looking at is this research, is this question. When people are recovering psychologically from a disaster, does it increase their activities toward future disaster preparedness? And does it have any influence on or interaction with their climate change risk perception and preparedness? So these handbooks were created after conducting the surveys, after conducting interviews, and after conducting the workshops, which you may choose to participate in the Maine workshops. These handbooks are meant to address preparedness needs based on what I learned during this research from those communities and for those communities. They're meant to be read and used by lay people, and they don't therefore include any of the theoretical research findings, which I haven't published yet, although I did present at a couple of conferences over the summer. Where you see a difference between the two books especially are in the disaster stories sections. Right after the survey results, so from Maui and also from American Samoa. In Maui, there was a lot of discussion about the slow disasters of drought and the compounding hazards that are associated with it, such as wildfire, but also even flooding and mudslides. Since the land is all dried out, it just washes away when the rain does come. There's also stories from tsunami warnings that occurred, but when the tsunamis arrived, they were very small waves, didn't actually cause very much damage, very minimal, no deaths, that sort of thing. And so in Maui, I was hearing a lot about these hazards, but within the personal experience of participants, there are no real large-scale disasters. There still could be in the future, and people were aware of this and wanted to be prepared for this, but the responses I was getting were very different from those that I was getting in American Samoa. In American Samoa, in 2009, and along with Western Samoa and Tonga, there was a tsunami that wiped out villages. And it happened so fast. The earthquakes that caused it were very close to the shore, and within 15-20 minutes the waves started hitting, and they were massive waves. They were washing away buildings, whole villages, pulling buses and people out into the water, out to sea. This happened during morning rush hour, so when people were on their way to work, kids were on their way to school or had just been dropped off at school. This was a devastating event to this country. Now the difference between the stories in Maui and American Samoa were really heavily correlated with the differences between their preparedness actions that they would later take for future disasters. In Maui, you'll see these stories of like the tsunami evacuation and where nothing really happened. The waves were really small, there wasn't very much damage, and there was no follow-up emergency planning, no discussion of, okay, what can we do next if this happens again, but the waves are big. And that can still happen. And people are aware of this, but again, that follow-up action just didn't occur. In American Samoa, on the other hand, one woman told me a story about running up the side of the mountain away from the wave, and her feet got wet, and she could hear people screaming behind her, and then they were gone. American Samoa has massively overhauled their emergency planning and response system. They have emergency sirens now. They did not have them before. There are multiple redundancies that are built into their system, their response system. At the time of the tsunami, the one system that they had for the emergency alert was offsite. It was in Hawaii, and it actually was down during the moment in which that event was happening. So the society as a whole has become much better prepared. They've put an awful lot of resources into ongoing planning and preparation, but individuals individually also told me about these preparedness actions that they've taken in their homes and their work for themselves, and individuals are much better prepared. And all of this is building on that personal experience that they've had. So going back to all that we've learned about disasters, about psychology, and about preparedness, and going back to you putting yourself into this role, for individuals and communities to actually take the steps in improving their disaster preparedness and response system, we either need to have strong advocates or we need to have experienced something truly terrible. And of course, even when we go that second route of learning from our past experiences, it is true that it's too late for those that we've already lost. History is littered with really terrible disasters, but it's not too late for future steps and future protections. And that brings us to today. So our assignments for the week, and I'm going to read them here. Reading reflection, I want you to answer all of the following questions. This is worth 75% of your grade for this module. I am not going to give you 75% of your entire grade in the first 2 weeks of class, so don't worry about that. This is just for this module. So describe a variety of the psychological reactions commonly experienced during and after the experience of trauma, as discussed in the articles by Bunny and Bonino, and cite the authors appropriately as you're discussing this. I know you're not going to be able to discuss all of them. That's fine. Tell me about some of them, right? Like what did you learn about, or what strikes you as particularly important that come out of these articles? Number two, what are some indications for which reactions may occur within any given individual or from any given event? And again, there's going to be a lot of different factors that go into this. You may want to talk about the specific psychological reactions that you discussed in the first question or different ones. It doesn't matter. Tell me what you have learned and what you are learning and what you know and what you think about this. Describe key decision-making issues that disaster and emergency professionals must consider to prepare themselves and communities for disaster, as described by Perry and Lindell, and cite this appropriately. And here also, what are some of the ways in which psychology of community members and of the responders themselves must be considered? So as I said in the introductory videos, the reflections should be as long as they need to be in order for you to tell me what you have learned in this module and your thoughts about what you have learned. In my experience, most students can do this in about 3 to 4 pages, double spaced, more or less depending on how wordy you are. So that's going to be kind of up to your own assessment. You can check in with me if you have any specific questions, and I will comment on your assignments on Blackboard, so make sure you check back to read those. But in general, what I want is not any particular one special magical answer that I think is the right one and none others. I want you to tell me what you are learning, what you think about what you are learning. Yeah. So the second assignment we have is applying the terminology to a real-life scenario. This is worth 25% of this module. I want you to choose a natural disaster that has happened in recent history. And recent history here means something that's been covered by the media. Yeah. So find news articles or other media that reported on this disaster, cite all of the sources with web links so that I can follow up on those. And how many of these web links, how many sources you need really does depend on the source itself. So particularly some disasters that have happened a little while back, there is often a lot of research and looking into what has happened there at all points along the way. So years prior to the disaster and all the preparedness and government and politics and human society and everything else. What happened at the moment has sometimes been picked apart very extensively, and then what happened in the response and in the recovery. Some articles are going to have all of this information for you, and you don't need any other article. You might just need the one. However, sometimes when you're looking up a disaster strike, particularly when it's fairly recent history, you'll see things like disaster struck today, we think this many people have died, we're still waiting for more information, and you have 3 sentences. You're going to need more than that. So with that, you're going to want to look up at a variety of different sources in order to start parsing out this information. So 2 questions I have for you for this activity is, one, I want you to tell me what are some of the psychological responses that were reported in the news coverage of the event. This can be either things that were specifically reported, this is the experience of people and the trauma that they had or the resilience that they had. This can be psychology that you are now able to identify yourself, even if it's not explicitly named, just from having gone through this module. It can be either or both. And number 2, what are some of the emergency preparedness and response actions that were reported in the news coverage of the event? And I have this question here because a lot of times we as individuals, as citizens, are looking at all of this reporting from a disaster, but it doesn't occur to us what all of these moving pieces are within disaster response professionals. I want you to be aware of those things, so tell me what you're able to see within the media. This is the shorter activity. It can probably be done in 1 to 2 pages, and that would include links to whichever sources you use and any descriptive information that you need to include about the disaster itself and or the news reporting itself. And that's all that we have for this module. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope to hear from you soon.